Marlene Colton's hands moved through darkness the way they always did, by memory, by instinct, by the stubborn refusal to let 36 men go hungry before the sun had the decency to rise. 4 o'clock in the morning, in the kitchen of Broken Ridge Ranch was hers alone. The cast iron stove ticked and groaned as she fed it, kindling, coaxing heat from cold metal, the way her father had taught her to coax life from hard ground. One match, one breath, one steady hand, and fire caught. She didn't need a lamp for this part. 6 years of the same kitchen, the same routine, the same careful dance between flour barrel and mixing bowl had carved the path into her muscles. Her fingers found the sack of flour by touch measured by weight, and feel what most women measured by cup and spoon. 3 scoops for the first batch, 4 for the second. Enough biscuits to fill 36 plates with extras for the men who worked the far pastures and came in late, dust-caked and silent and starving. Her father used to say a hungry cowboy was a dangerous cowboy. Henry Colton hadn't raised a daughter who let men go dangerous. The kitchen was the oldest building on Broken Ridge. Henry had built it first, before the bunkhouse, before the main house, before the corral or the barn. Because a man could sleep under stars and rope cattle in an open field, but he couldn't build a ranch without a place to feed the people who'd help him build it. That was Henry's philosophy. Feed them first, everything else follows. Marla had grown up in this kitchen the way other girls grew up in parlors and schoolrooms. She'd learned her numbers counting sacks of grain, learned her letters from the labels on canned goods shipped from St. Louis, learned to read men's faces the way her father read weather, watching for the signs of trouble before trouble arrived. She was 31 years old. She had buried her father 6 months ago in the red clay cemetery east of town, lowered him into ground so hard the gravediggers charged double. And she had not left this kitchen since. Not because she had nowhere to go. Because leaving meant admitting that everything Henry Colton built with his hands, in his sweat, in his stubborn, beautiful faith and hard work, had finally come to nothing. The flour barrel was running low. She made a note of it in her head the way she made notes of everything. 17 pounds left, maybe 18. At the rate she used it 4 days before she'd need to place an order. An order that would go through Harlan Briggs, who would inflate the cost by half-pocket the difference, and hand her an invoice that said she'd bought twice what actually arrived. She knew this, had known it for months, could prove it with nothing but the numbers she carried in her memory numbers no one would believe, because she was just the cook, just the dead man's daughter, just a woman standing in a kitchen that no longer belonged to her family, mixing biscuit dough in the dark because 36 men needed breakfast and somebody had to make it. The dough came together under her hands, smooth and forgiving in a way that the world outside this kitchen never was. She pressed it flat, folded it over, pressed again. The rhythm was meditation. The rhythm was memory. Her mother had stood at this same counter, working this same motion, teaching a girl barely tall enough to reach the flour barrel that bread was more than food. Bread was the language of care, spoken without words, understood by anyone with hunger in their belly and sense enough to appreciate the hands that fed them. Marla shaped the biscuits and laid them in rows on the blackened sheet pans her father had bought in San Antonio the year she was born. He'd carried them home in the back of a wagon alongside a new plow and a bolt of calico for her mother, and he'd presented all three with equal pride. Tools for building a life. That's what he called everything that came onto this ranch. Not purchases, not possessions, tools. Dawn bled pink across the eastern sky by the time she had the first trays in the oven. She stepped onto the kitchen porch to breathe air that hadn't been thickened by wood smoke and flour dust. The morning tasted like it always did in late summer Texas. Dry heat waiting to happen, dust that hadn't settled from yesterday, and underneath it all, the faint sweetness of prairie grass that her father used to say smelled like money if you knew how to raise cattle on it. Broken Ridge spread out before her in the gray half-light. 40,000 acres her father had built from a single quarter-section claim, expanding year by year, fence by fence, handshake by handshake. The main corral where he'd broken horses himself until his back gave out. The bunkhouse he'd built with lumber, hauled 60 miles from the nearest mill. The barn massive and weathered where he'd stored enough hay to survive 3 winters without buying a blade. All of it sold. Every fence post, every building, every blade of grass. Bought by some investor back east whose name she'd never heard transferred through an Austin bank while she was still wearing black from her father's funeral. The bank said Henry's debts made the sale necessary. The bank said she had no legal standing to contest. The bank said a lot of things that sounded like law, but felt like theft. The kitchen door banged open behind her. Coffee ready, Marla Harlan Briggs filled the doorway like a man who'd learned to take up space as a substitute for earning respect. He'd been foreman of Broken Ridge for 8 months now, hired 3 weeks before Henry died by a bank that wanted its own man watching the books. Before that, he'd been a ranch hand. Decent enough with cattle, her father had said. Nothing special, but reliable. Reliable had curdled into something else entirely once Harlan realized no one was checking his work. 10 minutes, Marla said without turning around. Same as every morning. Bankman's coming by this afternoon. Need you to sign some supply invoices. Her hands stilled against the porch railing. What invoices feed grain, coffee, dry goods? Nothing you need to worry about, just routine. Nothing about Harlan Briggs was routine anymore. Marla had learned to hear the lie beneath his words, the way a physician hears disease beneath a cough. It was there in the tightness of his jaw, the way his eyes moved sideways when he spoke the particular brand of casual that only came from careful rehearsal. I'll need to look them over first, she said. Marla. His voice dropped into that territory between friendly and threatening that he'd perfected over the past 6 months. You're the cook here, not the accountant, not the owner. Just sign where I point and keep the men fed. That's what you do best. The biscuit dough waiting inside was more forgiving than Marla felt. She wanted to tell him that she'd been counting cattle on this ranch before he'd ever set foot in Texas, that she knew every water source, every fence line, every acre of Broken Ridge better than Harlan knew the inside of the whiskey bottle he thought nobody noticed in his office drawer. Instead, she said coffee's on the stove, because that was what survival looked like in 1879 Texas. You swallowed the words that would get you fired, and you kept feeding the men who didn't know they were being robbed. You smiled when you wanted to scream, and you said, yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, and you saved your anger for the dark hours when nobody was watching, and the only witness to your fury was the dough beneath your fists. Harlan poured his coffee and left. Marla stood alone on the porch, watching him cross the yard with the borrowed swagger of a man wearing authority that didn't fit. Her knuckles whitened against the railing. 6 years of feeding ranch hands. 6 years of keeping this kitchen running through drought and disease, and her father's slow decline. And now she signed papers she knew were fraudulent, watched Harlan skim profits she couldn't prove he was taking, and pretended not to notice because the alternative was losing the last thread connecting her to Henry Colton's memory. She went back inside and pulled her recipe book from its shelf beside the stove, a leather-bound journal weathered soft by years of flour-dusted hands. Her mother had started it. Marla had continued it after her mother passed when Marla was 11. Recipes for sourdough bread and apple butter and the venison stew her father loved. But in the back pages, hidden behind instructions for pickling and preserving, Marla had been writing something else entirely. Numbers, dates, quantities. Every sack of flour that arrived at the kitchen door weighed and recorded. Every side of beef, every barrel of coffee, every delivery that came in short of what the invoices claimed. 3 months of careful documentation written in a hand small enough to look like recipe notes to anyone who glanced without reading closely. It wasn't enough, not yet. But Marla Colton had learned patience from a man who'd spent 30 years turning empty prairie into a working ranch. She could wait. She could watch. And when she had enough evidence to prove what Harlan was doing, she would find someone willing to listen. She tucked the journal back onto its shelf and finished preparing breakfast. The hands started filing in at 5:30. Dust-stained, weathered men who'd spent their lives in saddles and smelled like leather and tobacco, and the particular exhaustion that comes from working land that fights you for every blade of grass. They filled the long dining table with the easy familiarity of routine. Coffee pot passed without words. Sugar bowl followed. Cowboys didn't waste conversation before breakfast. Marla served them with the efficient precision of a woman who'd learned to feed crowds before most girls learned to dance. She moved down the table plate after plate, reading each man the way her father had taught her. Bruised knuckles on the young one who worked the stables. She brought him extra butter without being asked. The older hand at the far end who'd been coughing for a week. She made sure his coffee was hot enough to ease his chest. 36 men, and she knew every one of them. Their habits, their injuries, their small kindnesses and petty cruelties. She was counting heads the way she did every morning when she heard the horse. Single rider, moving slow. the kind of approach that spoke of either caution or exhaustion, and sometimes both. Marla stepped back onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The man came through the ranch gate on a bay mare that looked like she'd carried him across half of Texas without complaint. He sat tall despite obvious weariness. Dark hair under a trail-worn hat, a long coat that had seen better seasons, and a stillness about him that made you notice him before you noticed anything else. Not emptiness and tension, as if every part of him was engaged in the act of watching, of measuring, of waiting for something only he expected to find. He dismounted with the practiced economy of someone who'd spent more nights under open sky than under a roof. Every movement deliberate, nothing wasted. "Kitchen's through there," Marla called out. "Breakfast in 20 minutes if you're looking for work." The stranger tied his horse and looked at her for the first time. His eyes were the color of storm clouds gathering over the plains, gray that held lightning somewhere behind it. "Silas Calloway," he said, "heard you might need hands for the season. Foreman does the hiring, but we feed anyone willing to work." Marla studied him the way she studied all drifters who came through the gate, looking for the telltale signs she'd learned to recognize. Liquor on the breath, tremor in the fingers. That particular desperation that turned men mean when they thought no one was watching. She found none of it. What she found instead was something harder to name. A man who looked at Broken Ridge Ranch not like a place to earn wages, but like a place he already knew. "You know cattle?" she asked. "Some. Can you mend fence better than most? Then you'll probably get hired. Wash up at the pump. Don't come to my table with dirty hands." She turned back inside without seeing the way Silas Calloway stood motionless for a long moment, his gaze traveling across the ranch buildings, the corral, the rolling pasture stretching toward the horizon. Didn't see the way his jaw tightened or the way his fingers curled slowly into fists at his sides. This was his land. Every fence post, every building, every blade of grass. He'd bought it 6 weeks ago from an Austin bank eager to unload a property tangled in debt and corruption. The deed sat in his saddlebag legal and binding his name in black ink where Henry Colton's used to be. But the woman on that porch, flower-dusted and defiant, and feeding men from a kitchen that no longer belonged to her father, she hadn't appeared in any bank document. And something about the way she counted heads and noticed injuries and served every man with equal care told him that the real story of Broken Ridge Ranch was nothing like what the numbers in Austin had described. Silas washed his hands at the pump and followed the smell of coffee into the kitchen. He took a seat at the far end of the table, his back against the wall. Old habit, men in his line of work didn't sit with their backs to doors. New face. A young kid, maybe 17, slid onto the bench across from him, lean and sun-darkened with the nervous energy that came from being the youngest hand on a ranch full of grown men. "I'm Lee Pruitt. Work the stables mostly. You here for the fall roundup? Just looking for steady work." Lee glanced toward the kitchen where Marla moved between stove and table. "Then watch yourself around Harlan," he said quietly. "Foreman's got a short fuse and a long memory, especially when it comes to anyone getting close to the kitchen." Before Silas could respond, Marla appeared with a platter of biscuits, golden brown and steaming, the kind that split open to reveal layers soft as cloud. She moved down the table with the same careful attention she gave everything, and when she reached Silas, she set his plate down and held his gaze for exactly half a second. "You'll see Harlan after breakfast. He'll tell you what needs doing." "Appreciated." She moved on. Silas found himself watching despite every professional instinct telling him to look away. The way she refilled old Ferris's coffee before the old man had to ask. The way she counted plates automatically, making sure no one went without. The way she carried exhaustion in her shoulders, but never let it reach her hands. This was a woman who'd turned feeding people into something that looked like defiance. Harlan Briggs entered at last, claiming the head of the table the way a man claims a throne he hasn't earned. Thick through the shoulders, carrying the weight of authority he hadn't built, but had borrowed from a dead man's reputation. He ate without acknowledging Marla's cooking, spoke without thanking her service, and when he finished, he stood and pointed at Silas. "You, Calloway. North pasture fence needs work. Cattle keep pushing through to Nettles land. Take the Pruitt kid with you. He knows where the wire is." Silas nodded. After breakfast, he found Lee at the barn, loading fence posts and wire onto a wagon. "He's got you on the worst detail," Lee said with the cheerful resignation of youth. "North pasture fence is a disaster. Last hand who tried gave up after 2 days. Why so bad? Ground's rocky. Posts won't hold. And every time we fix one section, cattle push through somewhere else. Lee paused, his face clouding. Plus Nettles' land borders that stretch. Him and Harlan supposedly hate each other. Been arguing property lines for years. Supposedly, Lee didn't answer that. They rode out in silence, the sun climbing toward its brutal midday peak. The land rolled out ahead of them in waves of dry grass and scrub oak, punctuated by the occasional stand of mesquite, casting thin shadows that offered no real relief from the heat. Jackrabbits bolted from their path. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, patient and indifferent, hunting with the economy of effort that came from knowing exactly what it was looking for. The fence was worse than Lee had described. Posts leaning at angles that defied gravity, wires sagging like old clothesline, entire sections trampled flat. In one stretch of nearly 40 yards, the fence had simply ceased to exist, posts pulled from the ground and thrown aside, wire coiled in rusted heaps that no one had bothered to collect. Cattle tracks crossed freely between Broken Ridge and Nettles land, a highway of hoof prints that told the story of months without maintenance. But Silas had worked enough ranches to know the difference between cattle damage and neglect. This wasn't cows pushing through weak spots. This was systematic abandonment. Someone had stopped maintaining this fence on purpose. And in ranching, a neglected boundary fence meant one of two things: the owner couldn't afford to fix it, or someone wanted the cattle to cross. Given what Silas had seen in the Austin bank records, he was betting on the latter. Lee, he said, carefully hammering a post into rocky ground. How long has it been like this? We do months. The kid's hammer rang against iron. Ever since he stopped. Since when? Lee worked in silence for a long moment. Since Mr. Colton died. Whole place started falling apart. Harlan says we're short-handed, but he shook his head. Not my business. Silas let the silence stretch. Patience was the sharpest tool in his kit. He'd learned that across 8 years and 17 investigations. People told you more in the spaces between words than they ever told you directly. They worked until the sun was directly overhead, sweat soaking through shirts, hands raw from wire. Then Lee spoke again quietly, like a man testing a bridge before trusting it with his weight. The supply orders don't match what we actually get. Silas kept his eyes on the fence. That's so Marla knows. She keeps inventory in her head. Has for years. Knows down to the pound how much flour she uses, how many eggs the hens lay, everything. And she's been saying for months that something's off. What does Harlan say? That she's a woman who doesn't understand ranch business. Lee's voice carried an edge that surprised Silas with its intensity. But I help unload the supply wagons sometimes. I see what comes off those wagons, and it isn't half what the invoices say. There it was, confirmation of what the Austin bank records had suggested. Inflated supply costs, skimmed profits, manufactured debt. Classic embezzlement made easier because the actual owner was supposed to be some distant investor who'd never questioned the numbers. Except the actual owner was here now, eating biscuits, mending fence, and watching everything. Does Marla know for certain? Silas asked. She more than suspects. She's been writing things down in that recipe book of hers. Thinks nobody notices, but I've seen her. Counting deliveries, recording dates. She's building something. I just don't know what. Silas absorbed that. The woman wasn't just enduring, she was fighting, quietly, methodically, with the only weapons available to her: a good memory and a recipe journal. They rode back for dinner as the sun tilted toward afternoon. The kitchen smelled like roast chicken and cornbread. Marla had the table set for 36, every plate positioned with the precision of a woman who'd elevated feeding people into an art form that nobody appreciated because it happened every single day. Silas took his seat at the far end. Marla served him without meeting his eyes, but he noticed something he hadn't seen at breakfast. A slight tremor in her hands. Something had happened between meals. Harlan entered late, his expression thunderous. Marla, he said. Office, now. Dinner's on the table, she replied without turning from the stove. Now, Harlan's voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. Bankman came early. Papers need signing before he leaves. The kitchen went silent. 36 men suddenly fascinated by their plates. Cowboys learned early to keep their heads down when management fought. Marla set her serving spoon down with the careful deliberation of someone controlling something much larger than a kitchen utensil. She walked toward the office, her spine straight as a fence post, and the door closed behind them. The silence in the dining room thickened. Lee caught Silas's eye across the table and shook his head slightly. Don't. But Silas was already listening. The office was 20 feet from the kitchen, and Harlan's voice carried when he was angry. Told you not to question the numbers. Harlan's words came through the thin walls like blows. Then Marla's voice, steady but strained. This invoice says we bought 300 pounds of coffee last month, Harlan. We don't use that much in half a year. Are you calling me a liar? I'm saying the numbers are wrong, and I want to see the actual delivery receipts, not the bank copies, the originals, a sound like a hand slamming flat on a desk. You want receipts? You'll get receipts when I decide you need them. This ranch is drowning because your father couldn't manage money, and the only thing keeping it above water is my work. So you'll sign what I tell you to sign, and you'll be grateful you still have a kitchen to stand in. My father was not a poor manager. Marla's voice shook, not with weakness, with the kind of controlled fury that comes from women who've learned to keep their rage on a leash, because letting it loose would cost them everything. Your father, Harlan said with deliberate cruelty, died owing more money than this ranch will ever be worth. That's not poor management. That's failure, pure and simple. Silence from behind the door, then Marla's voice, deadly quiet. Show me the delivery receipts. All of them. Or I walk to Red Hollow and talk to Sheriff Dawson myself. The sheriff trusts me, not you. You're a cook, Marla. Nobody's going to take your word over mine about ranch finances. Then I suppose we'll find out. Footsteps. The office door opened. Marla walked out with her composure intact, her eyes bright with something between rage and determination. She returned to the kitchen, picked up her serving spoon, and continued feeding 36 men as if nothing had happened. But Silas saw what no one else noticed. As Marla passed the office doorway, her right hand moved to her apron pocket. Quick and smooth, the motion of a woman who'd practiced sleight of hand in the privacy of her own kitchen. Something white disappeared into the fabric. A piece of paper, an invoice, evidence. She'd stolen it right off Harlan's desk while he was too busy insulting her father's memory to notice. Silas looked down at his plate to hide what must have been visible on his face. Admiration. Because Marla Colton wasn't waiting to be rescued. She wasn't hoping someone would notice her suffering and ride in to fix it. She was building her case one stolen document at a time using the only cover she had. The kitchen, the apron, the invisibility that came with being the woman who fed everyone and threatened no one. That night, after the hands had eaten and dispersed to the bunkhouse, Silas sat on the porch watching the sun bleed out across the Texas horizon. Lee joined him, bringing 2 cups of coffee, strong enough to dissolve horseshoe nails. You heard them arguing, the kid said. It wasn't a question. Hard not to. She does that every time. Questions the numbers. Harlan shuts her down. She goes back to cooking. Lee stared into his coffee. But she doesn't stop. Keeps track of everything. I've been helping her when I can. Watching the delivery wagons, counting what comes off. She asked you to do that? Didn't have to. Lee's jaw set with the stubbornness of youth that hasn't yet learned to be afraid of consequences. Mr. Colton was good to my family. Gave my father work when nobody else would. I figure watching out for his daughter is the least I can do. Silas sipped his coffee and said nothing. The kid's loyalty was genuine, and that was worth more than a dozen signed affidavits. After Lee went to bed, Silas sat alone in the darkness. The weight of his deception pressed against his ribs like a stone. He'd bought this ranch to expose corruption, to stop a railroad syndicate from swallowing small operations across Texas. It was supposed to be clean, clinical. Document the fraud, build the case, hand it to the lawyers, move on. But Marla Colton had complicated everything. She wasn't a victim waiting for justice. She was a woman already fighting for it with a recipe book and stolen invoices, and the unshakable memory of a father who taught her that numbers don't lie even when men do. And every day Silas maintained his cover, sitting at her table, eating her biscuits, watching her sign papers she knew were fraudulent. He was lying to her, not with words, with silence. And silence, he was learning, was the cruelest kind of lie. The kitchen door opened behind him. Marla stepped onto the porch, a shawl pulled around her shoulders against the cooling night. You're still here, she said. Seemed like a good night for sitting. She settled against the porch railing. Her gaze traveled across the darkened ranch, across buildings her father had raised, and fences he'd strung, and land he'd loved fiercely enough to die trying to keep. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I need you to understand something about this place. This ranch is all I have left of my father. Every post he drove into this ground, every wall he raised, every morning I wake up and light that stove, I'm not just cooking, I'm proving he built something that mattered." Her voice cracked on the final word and she paused to gather it back together. "He came to Texas with $40 and a mule that died before he reached the Brazos. Did you know that started with nothing? Less than nothing. Worked other men's cattle for 3 years to save enough for his first quarter section. And then he built. Not fast, not flashy, but steady. The way a river cuts stone. Year after year after year, until Broken Ridge was the finest operation in 3 counties. People came from as far as Fort Worth to buy his breeding stock." Marla's gaze moved across the darkened buildings as if she could still see her father moving among them, checking the barn doors at night, counting cattle at dawn, sitting on this very porch with a cup of coffee and a look of quiet satisfaction that said, a man didn't need to be rich to be wealthy. Watching Harlan Briggs tear it apart piece by piece, lie by lie, is like burying my father again every single day. The night insects filled the silence with their endless chorus. Stars emerged above, cold and bright and indifferent to the struggles of people who live beneath them. "So I signed the papers," Marla continued, her voice steady again. "Even when I know they're wrong. Because the alternative is losing everything right now, today, this minute. At least this way I get to keep fighting. Even if the fight is just a woman with a recipe book and a good memory going up against a man with the bank and the sheriff and every advantage the world gives men who wear authority like it belongs to them." She stood, pulling the shawl tighter. "Get some sleep, Mr. Calloway. Morning comes early." She went inside. The door closed softly behind her. Silas sat alone with the stars and the terrible knowledge that the woman who'd just poured her heart out to a stranger was fighting a battle she didn't know she'd already half won. Because the evidence she was gathering in that recipe book, the stolen invoices, the careful counting, all of it aligned with what he'd found in the Austin bank records. Together, their documentation would be devastating. But telling her meant revealing everything. And revealing everything meant becoming another man who'd made decisions about her life without asking what she wanted. Inside the kitchen, Marla stood at the window watching the drifter on her porch. Something about Silas Calloway didn't match the pattern. He watched too carefully, spoke too precisely, carried himself with the composure of a man who'd faced worse than fence posts and cattle and still chosen thought over instinct. She should be suspicious, should keep distance. But for the first time in 6 months of signing Harlan's lies, someone had sat on her porch and listened without telling her she was wrong. And that small thing, that simple act of not dismissing her, felt like rain after a long drought. Marla pulled the curtain closed, then opened her recipe journal to the back pages. By lamplight, she recorded the day's numbers. Supplies received versus invoiced. Cattle count from her morning observation at the kitchen window, 12 head fewer than last week. And the invoice she'd stolen from Harlan's desk, smooth, flat, and pressed between pages of instructions for sourdough starter. Evidence. Building slowly the way her father had built this ranch, one careful piece at a time. She didn't have enough yet, but she was close. Closer than Harlan knew. Closer than anyone knew. 36 men needed feeding in the morning. Her father's ranch needed saving. And somewhere in the growing stack of numbers hidden in a recipe book, the truth was taking shape. She just needed a little more time. And maybe, just maybe, the drifter, with storm gray eyes, who listened without judging and washed his own plate without being asked, maybe he was worth trusting. Not yet, not fully, but enough to keep watching. The way she watched everything on Broken Ridge Ranch, carefully, quietly, with the patience of a woman who'd learned that the longest fights were won not by the strongest, but by the ones who refused to stop. 3 days of watching taught Marla more than 3 months of suspicion ever had. She compared the stolen invoice against her recipe journal. By lamplight, the kitchen door bolted a towel stuffed beneath it to hide the glow from anyone passing outside. The numbers were worse than she'd imagined. Harlan had billed the ranch for 200 pounds of flour at 3 times market price. The actual delivery, which she'd weighed herself the morning it arrived, was 94 pounds. The difference, more than 100 pounds of flour that never existed, had been converted to cash that went straight into Harlan Briggs' pocket. She turned the page. Coffee, 300 pounds invoiced. She used roughly 50 pounds a month for 36 men who drank it black and strong from before dawn until after dark. 50 pounds, not 300. The surplus on paper was pure fiction, and the money it generated was pure theft. Page after page, the pattern repeated. Salt pork sugar grain for the workhorses, feed for breeding stock. Every line item inflated, every delivery short, and every invoice signed by Marla Colton, whose name on the paper gave Harlan's fraud the appearance of oversight and approval. She closed the journal and pressed her palms flat against the kitchen table. The wood was scarred from thousands of meals. Knife marks and burn rings in the faint impression where her father used to rest his coffee cup every morning while she cooked. She could feel his presence in this room the way she felt weather changing. Not visible, but real. "What would you do?" she whispered to the empty kitchen. Henry Colton would have thrown Harlan off the property with his bare hands. But Henry was gone, and his daughter didn't have the luxury of righteous violence. She had a recipe book full of damning numbers, and no one in a position of power willing to listen. Not yet. Marla pulled up 3 floorboards beneath the pantry shelf. The space underneath was small and dry, lined with cedar planks her father had fitted during the Comanche raids of '62. He'd built it to hide valuables when the ranch was young and the frontier was dangerous. Ammunition deed papers, the silver pocket watch his own father had carried through the war. A place to protect what mattered most. Now it held Marla's evidence. The stolen invoice, her recipe journal with its months of careful documentation. A list of dates when she'd counted the cattle herd from her kitchen window and found it short. She added tonight's comparison, folded neat, and fitted the floorboards back into place. Nobody would think to look beneath a woman's pantry for proof of a man's crimes. That was the advantage of being invisible. You could hide things in plain sight because no one bothered to look at you closely enough to notice. She slept 2 hours that night, dreamed of her father standing at the corral fence counting cattle the way he'd taught her. Every head accounted for, every number true. Morning came the way it always did, dark and demanding and indifferent to how little she'd slept. 36 men needed breakfast. The stove needed lighting. The flour barrel needed emptying into mixing bowls because biscuits didn't make themselves, not even when the woman making them had spent the night documenting the systematic destruction of everything her father had built. Silas Calloway was the first hand in the kitchen. He sat at the far end of the table, his back to the wall, his coffee untouched, watching her with those gray eyes that saw too much and said too little. "Morning," he offered. Morning. She served him first because he was there, not because of anything else. And if she noticed that he'd already washed his hands before sitting down, that he held his coffee cup with both hands, the way men did when they were thinking hard about something, that he watched her count plates with an expression that might have been recognition, she didn't let it show. The rest of the hands filed in. Routine. Familiar. The last normal morning Broken Ridge Ranch would know for a long time, though none of them could have predicted that. Harlan called the meeting after breakfast. "Mandatory," he said. "All hands. Ranch office. Now." 36 cowboys packed into a room built for 8. The air thickened with sweat and leather and the sour tang of men who sensed bad news coming. Marla stood at the back, her arms crossed over her apron, her expression carved from the same stone that lined the creek beds of Broken Ridge. Harlan leaned against the desk. He'd put on a clean shirt, polished his boots, the small vanities of a man preparing to deliver a performance rather than information. "Boys," he began, and the word itself was an insult to men who'd earned the right to be called by their names. "We've got a financial situation. Ranch debts are worse than expected. The bank in Austin is demanding payment on outstanding loans, and if we can't produce the cash, Broken Ridge goes to auction." The room shifted, 36 men doing the math of their own survival. How much old Ferris asked from the corner. He'd been working cattle since before most of the hands were born. His voice carried weight that Harlan's never would, more than normal operations can cover. Harlan let the silence do his work for him. "So here's what's happening. Starting next month, wages get cut, 20% across the board. Temporary measure until the financial picture improves." Anger moved through the room like heat through metal, low and dangerous. "We already work below market rate," someone said from the back. "You want us to take less for the same hours, then find work elsewhere." Harlan's voice hardened into the tone he used when he wanted men to remember he controlled their livelihoods. but anyone who leaves forfeits their final pay. Those are the terms. Marla had been waiting, calculating, choosing the moment the way her father had taught her to choose the moment when breaking a horse. Not too early when the animal still had fight, not too late when the crowd had already accepted defeat. Right at the tipping point when one voice could change the direction of 36 minds. What about the cattle sales, Harlan? Every head turned toward the back of the room, toward the cook, toward the woman who was supposed to sign papers and stay silent. Marla stepped forward. Not far, just enough to be seen clearly by every man in the room. We've been selling stock all month. I've counted the herd from my kitchen window every morning for 3 months. We're down 42 heads since June. Where is that money going? Harlan's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes contracted. The involuntary flinch of a man who'd underestimated his opponent. Cattle sales barely cover operating costs, Marla. You'd understand that if you knew anything about ranch economics beyond how much flour to put in a biscuit. I know the price of beef in this county. Marla's voice was level conversational and absolutely lethal. I know what 42 head of prime stock sells for at market. And I know that number doesn't appear anywhere in the accounts you've been showing the bank. The room went so quiet you could hear the wind moving through grass outside. Your father left this place in shambles. Harlan abandoned the polished performance. His voice turned raw, the real man, emerging from behind the foreman's mask. I've been cleaning up his mess for 8 months. Every dollar I've brought in has gone to keeping this ranch alive, despite his incompetence. Henry Colton was a dreamer who couldn't manage money, couldn't manage land, couldn't manage anything except his own reputation as some kind of pioneer saint. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Every man felt the impact. Every man knew the accusation was aimed not just at a dead man, but at the woman who carried his name. Marla's hand found the kitchen knife on the desk beside her. She didn't remember reaching for it, didn't remember her fingers closing around the handle, but suddenly it was in her grip and she was moving, crossing the space between herself and Harlan with the focused intensity of a woman who'd been swallowing rage for 6 months and had finally reached the bottom of her tolerance. 3 feet from Harlan, 2 feet. The blade caught lamplight and threw it against the wall in a thin, bright line. Silas moved, not between them. He would never insult her that way, but close enough that his voice reached her before the knife could reach Harlan. Your father built something worth defending, he said quietly. Words meant for her alone in a room full of listening men. Don't let him turn you into something that can't defend it anymore. Marla stopped. The knife trembled in her hand. Harlan had gone white, pressed back against the desk, the bravado stripped from his face like paint, peeling from old wood. She lowered the blade, set it on the desk with a sound that barely registered, but that every man in the room would remember for years. Then she spoke, not to Silas, not to Harlan, to the room. If any man in this room ever speaks about Henry Colton that way again, I will make certain that every ranch, every cattlemen's association, every newspaper from here to Austin knows exactly what kind of operation Harlan Briggs has been running. And I have the numbers to prove it. She turned and walked out. Spine straight, shoulders steady. The door closed behind her with the quiet precision of a woman who understood that controlled exits spoke louder than slammed doors. The meeting dissolved. Cowboys filed out in heavy silence, nobody meeting Harlan's eyes. The foreman stood alone in his office, his composure shattered, staring at the knife Marla had left on his desk. Silas waited until the room emptied before approaching him. That was a mistake, he said conversationally. Buck off, Calloway. She's the only person keeping this ranch functional. Push her again, and she walks. Then what you cook for 36 men yourself, what I do is none of your concern. Maybe not. Silas leaned against the doorframe. But I noticed something interesting this morning. Saw you out by the loading pens at dawn, shaking hands with a man driving a wagon that said Nettles Cattle Company. Saw money change hands. Saw a dozen head of prime beef loaded up and hauled away. Harlan's face went from white to scarlet in the space of a breath. Funny thing is, Silas continued, I looked at the ranch log afterward. No sale recorded, no income noted, almost like those cattle just vanished into thin air, along with whatever Grover Nettles paid for them. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the meeting. This was the silence between the lightning and the thunder, The moment when both men understood that the pretense was over. "You're fired," Harlan said. "Pack your gear. Off the property by sunset. Your property, my ranch, my rules. Get out or I'll have a Sheriff Dawson haul you out." Silas headed for the door. He'd pushed too far, revealed too much, compromised his position for the satisfaction of watching fear cross Harlan's face. It was a mistake, and he knew it, and he'd made it anyway because watching that man insult Henry Colton's daughter in front of 36 witnesses had overridden 8 years of professional discipline. He was saddling his horse when Marla appeared at the barn door. Not tearful, not grateful, not any of the things a woman in a story was supposed to be when a man fought on her behalf. She was sharp-eyed and direct and radiating the particular anger that comes from intelligence denied its proper outlet. "You know something," she said, "something you haven't told me. Something about this ranch, about Harlan, about why you're really here." It wasn't a question. It was a reading. The same way she read supply invoices and cattle counts and the faces of men who sat at her table. She'd been watching Silas Calloway for days, and whatever she'd seen didn't match the pattern of an ordinary drifter looking for seasonal work. Silas could lie, could maintain cover, could ride out and come back in a week with reinforcements from Austin. The professionally correct response. Instead, he looked at this woman who kept a secret ledger in a recipe book and stole evidence from a man twice her size and stood in front of 36 men demanding accountability while holding a kitchen knife like a sword, and he made a decision that would change both their lives. He'd made similar decisions before. In Colorado, when he'd revealed himself to a rancher's wife who was about to lose her home to a forged deed. In New Mexico, when he'd shown his credentials to a sheriff who turned out to be on the syndicate's payroll. Each time the revelation had been calculated, strategic timed for maximum legal impact. This was different. This wasn't strategy. This was a man standing in a barn that smelled of hay and leather, looking at a woman who deserved the truth and had deserved it since the morning she'd served him his first cup of coffee, and finally being unable to carry the lie for one more minute. "I bought this ranch," he said, "6 weeks ago, from the Austin Bank. I own Broken Ridge." The words fell between them like a wall collapsing. Marla didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe, it seemed, for a long time. The barn smelled of hay and horse sweat and the distant smoke of a kitchen where biscuits were cooling on a rack because she'd put them in the oven before coming to find a man she'd sensed was hiding something larger than a drifter's past. When she finally spoke, her voice was the quietest he'd ever heard it. "You sat at my table. 9 days. You ate biscuits I baked with flour. I stretched because I thought we couldn't afford more. You watched me sign Harlan's papers. Watched me beg for scraps of my father's legacy. Watched me pour my heart out on that porch about losing everything. And the whole time you owned it. All of it. My kitchen, my father's land, everything." Silas said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. Marla was silent for a very long time. Not an empty silence, but a full one, a woman rearranging everything she thought she knew about the past 9 days. Every conversation, every meal, every moment she'd believed she was alone in her fight. Then something shifted in her face. The pain didn't leave, but something harder rose up beside it. Something that looked less like grief and more like the cold, clear focus of a woman making a decision. "I don't need your apology," she said. "I need to know if you can help me take back my father's ranch." Silas stared at her. He'd expected rage, expected the slap he probably deserved, expected tears or accusations or the door slamming shut on whatever fragile thing had been building between them over 9 days of coffee and quiet conversation. He hadn't expected negotiation. "Can you prove Harlan's been stealing?" she asked. "Prove it in a way that holds up beyond my memory. In a recipe book, I have the Austin Bank records showing what Harlan reported versus what was actually delivered. I have documentation of cattle sales that never appeared in the ledger. Combined with what you've been collecting, it's enough to build a case. Then we build it. Together." Marla's jaw set. "But understand something, Mr. Calloway. You lied to me. You sat in my kitchen, and you lied by every silence. I'm choosing to set that aside because right now saving this ranch matters more than punishing your deception. But we are going to reckon with it after," Silas agreed. Before either of them could say more, Lee Pruitt came stumbling around the corner of the barn. Blood sheeted from his nose, painting his chin and shirt front crimson. One eye was swelling shut. He moved with the lurching gait of someone who'd been hit hard enough or to rearrange their sense of direction. Marla was there before Silas could react. She caught the boy as his knees buckled, eased him down against the barn wall, pressed her apron to his face with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd been patching up cowboys since she was old enough to hold a bandage. What happened? Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. Everything about Marla Colton was steady when someone needed her to be. Harlan, Lee's voice came thick and wet through the blood. Found out I've been helping you, watching the deliveries, counting supplies. He cornered me by the water trough, said if I talked to anyone else, he'd make sure I never worked another ranch in Texas. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. The professional distance he'd maintained for 9 days, the careful separation between investigator and invested party collapsed completely. Where is Harlan now, he asked. Main house. Lee winced as Marla examined his nose. Sending for Sheriff Dawson. Says he's got troublemakers need removing from the property. The pieces connected with the speed and clarity that comes from years of watching corrupt men follow predictable patterns. Harlan was escalating. Firing Silas wasn't enough. Beating Lee wasn't enough. He needed the authority of law to remove everyone who threatened his operation before his operation could be exposed. And Sheriff Dawson, who'd served Red Hollow for 15 years, without ever asking Harlan a difficult question, would arrive predisposed to believe whatever story the foreman told him. Lee Silas said, "Can you ride? Think so. Get to the telegraph office in Red Hollow. Send a wire to the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin. Tell them Silas Calloway at Broken Ridge Ranch needs federal jurisdiction on a fraud and embezzlement case tied to railroad land acquisition." Lee looked at Marla. She nodded once. "Go. Take the back trail so Harlan doesn't see you leave." The kid mounted up with the determination of youth that hasn't yet learned what it's risking. He was gone before the dust settled. Sheriff Dawson arrived within the hour. He was an older man, weathered and creased, and softened by years of choosing the path of least resistance. He listened to Harlan's version of events on the main house porch, while Marla and Silas watched from the kitchen door. "That's him," Harlan said, pointing at Silas. "Troublemaker. Been here less than 2 weeks already, threatening me, making wild accusations, turning my hands against me. I want him off the property." Dawson walked over slowly, the walk of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Calloway, Harlan says you've been making accusations about ranch business. Threatening him, causing disruption. Not accusations, Sheriff. Documentation." Silas kept his voice level. "Harlan Briggs has been embezzling from this ranch for months. I can prove it. He's lying." Harlan called from the porch. "He's a drifter trying to con his way into the operation." Dawson sighed. "You got any paper to back up what you're saying?" "Calloway, I own this ranch." Silas pulled the deed from his coat. "Check the county records. It's registered under my name. Has been for 6 weeks. Something shifted in Dawson's posture. The lazy indifference tightened into something more alert. "You're the buyer from Austin, yes. And I came here specifically to investigate why a profitable ranch was suddenly drowning in manufactured debt." Dawson looked at the deed, looked at Harlan, looked at the deed again. Then he did something neither Silas nor Marla expected. He turned back toward the main house. "Harlan," he said slowly, "I think maybe I ought to have a look at those ranch ledgers after all." Harlan's composure cracked, not dramatically, just a fissure, a hairline fracture running through the mask of the confident foreman, visible only to people watching very closely. Marla noticed. "Now, Sheriff," Harlan said, stepping backward, "those are private business documents. You'd need a court order to—" "I'm not asking for a court order. I'm asking as a friend. Let me see the books so I can put this to rest and send this stranger on his way." Dawson climbed the porch steps, Harlan back through the main house door. Marla gripped Silas's arm. "Something's wrong," she said. "Harlan's scared, really scared. When he's scared, he does." The gunshot split the afternoon open like an axe through dry wood. Marla ran, Silas ran. They reached the main house porch to find Dawson on the floor, clutching his shoulder blood spreading dark and wet through his shirt. Harlan stood over him, a smoking pistol hanging from his hand, his face the color of old ash. "He was going to take the books," Harlan said to no one. He was going to see everything. I couldn't. All my work, everything I built, I couldn't let him. His voice had the disconnected quality of a man listening to himself from a great distance, surprised by the words coming from his own mouth, surprised by the weight of the pistol still warm in his hand, surprised by the blood spreading across the floor of a house that had once belonged to a man who'd built it with honest timber and honest labor. Cowboys came running from every direction. They saw the gun, saw the sheriff bleeding, saw the truth written in gun smoke, and Harlan's shaking hands. Some of them had suspected for months, some had known for longer. But suspecting a man of stealing money and witnessing him shoot a lawman were separated by a distance so vast that most of them simply stopped where they stood, unable to bridge the gap between what they believed about the world 5 seconds ago and what they now knew to be true. Marla moved first, not toward Harlan, toward Dawson. She dropped to her knees, pressing both hands against the wound, her apron already soaking through with someone else's blood. "Someone get the doctor," she ordered. Her voice carried across the yard with the authority of a woman accustomed to commanding a kitchen that fed 36 people 3 times a day. "You ride for Red Hollow, fast. You two bring clean cloth and hot water from the kitchen." Now, men moved, not because Silas told them to, because Marla Colton told them to, and in this moment with the foreman standing over a shot lawman and the world turned upside down, the woman who'd fed them every day for 6 years was the only person on Broken Ridge Ranch that anyone trusted. Silas handled Harlan, disarmed him, twisted his wrist, put him face down in the dirt with a knee in his back. The foreman didn't resist. Whatever calculation had driven him to pull the trigger had burned through to the other side, leaving nothing but the hollow understanding that everything was over. "Rope," Silas called. "Somebody bring rope." Old Ferris brought it. Silas bound Harlan's hands while the foreman stared at nothing. On the barch, Marla kept pressure on Dawson's wound. The sheriff was conscious, his face gray with pain and something like shame. Should have listened, he managed. Should have asked harder questions. "Stay quiet," Marla told him. "Save your strength." Should have believed you, Marla. About the numbers. About all of it. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer because answering would mean acknowledging that 6 months of suffering might have been prevented if one man in authority had taken a woman's word over a foreman's smile. The doctor arrived from Red Hollow. Dawson was stabilized and loaded onto a wagon for transport to town. Harlan went with him, bound and silent, his empire of falsified invoices and stolen cattle money collapsing into dust. The ranch fell into an uneasy quiet. Cowboys stood in loose groups, uncertain, leaderless, looking at each other the way men look, when the structure they've been operating within suddenly disappears. Marla washed Dawson's blood from her hands at the kitchen pump. The water ran pink, then clear. She dried her hands on a towel that wasn't stained with someone else's crisis and walked back inside to finish preparing dinner. Because 36 men still needed feeding, and some things didn't stop just because the world caught fire. The fire came at midnight. Marla smelled it before she heard it. Smoke carrying through the kitchen window on a breeze that should have brought nothing but cool night air and the sound of crickets. She was out of bed and on the porch in seconds, still wearing her nightgown, her feet bare on rough wood. The barn, orange light crawled up the far wall where hay bales stood stacked against dry timber. Not one point of origin. Three. 3 separate fires spaced evenly along the building's length, burning with the deliberate geometry of arson. Fire, her voice shattered the silence louder than the gunshot had that afternoon. She was already running, grabbing buckets from the kitchen porch, filling them at the pump, with hands that moved from muscle memory. The barn, get the horses out. Cowboys poured from the bunkhouse in various states of undress, boots, unlaced shirts, unbuttoned, but moving with the automatic urgency of men who understood that a barn fire on a Texas ranch could take everything. A barn held more than horses. It held feed and tack and tools and the winter stores that meant the difference between survival and starvation when the cold months came. Losing a barn in August meant scrambling to rebuild before the first norther blew through in November, and every man on Broken Ridge knew it. Marla organized them, not Silas. Marla. Because she knew this ranch knew where every water barrel was stored, knew which doors opened inward and which opened out, knew that the horses in the far stalls would need blankets over their eyes to be led through smoke. She knew which animals were skittish and which were steady, which could be led with a halter and which would need to be blindfolded and dragged. 6 years of feeding the men who worked these animals had taught her as much about the horses as the cowhands themselves knew. Lee, take 3 men, water line from the creek, bucket brigade. Ferris, get the tack room cleared before it catches. Callaway the horses. Far stalls first. They're closest to the flames. Men moved at her command. She ran for the barn doors herself, throwing them wide, plunging into smoke thick enough to chew. Inside, horses screamed. The sound of animals in terror was something you never forgot, a sound that bypassed thought and went straight to the part of the brain that understood helplessness. Marla pulled 2 horses out before the smoke drove her back. Silas passed her, going in a wet cloth over his mouth, heading for the far stalls where the fire burned hottest. She followed him. They worked in choking darkness, lit by hell's own light. Stall doors thrown open. Terrified animals dragged towards safety. The heat pressed against their skin like a living thing trying to push them back. Silas was pulling the last mare when the beam fell. It came down from the loft in a shower of sparks and burning hay, crashing across the aisle between him and the door. The mare bolted sideways, crashing through a weakened stall wall. Silas went down, not crushed but pinned by debris, coughing half-blind from smoke. Marla didn't hesitate. She grabbed a feed trough, wooden and heavy and solid enough to lever the beam sideways. She threw her weight against it. Once. Twice. The beam shifted. Silas pulled free. "Move," she shouted, grabbing his arm, hauling him upright. They ran for the gap in the flames, hit the night air together, stumbled clear, just as the roof began its slow groaning collapse. Lee was there. Old Ferris was there. Hands pulling them further from the heat, dousing them with water. Counting heads. Horses. Marla gasped between coughs. All 16, Lee reported. Every one. Marla sat in the dirt watching the barn her father had built with lumber, hauled 60 miles burned to its skeleton. The flames reflected in her eyes, orange and terrible and final. Around her, cowboys fought the fire with bucket brigades and wet blankets, trying to save what couldn't be saved because that's what men did when the alternative was standing still. "Someone set this," she said quietly. 3 ignition points, hay stacked against walls. This was planned. "One of our night watches is missing." Old Ferris reported. "Robert Hatch. His bunk's cleared out. Gear's gone." Harlan's man Silas said, sitting beside her in the dirt, still breathing hard from smoke. "Probably been on his payroll for weeks, just waiting for the signal." Marla nodded slowly. The fire had taken the barn, but it hadn't taken the cellar beneath the kitchen floor. Her evidence was safe. Her recipe journal, the stolen invoices, the careful months of documentation that no one knew about except her and a boy who'd ridden to Red Hollow with a bloody nose and a telegraph message aimed at Austin. The fire burned itself out before dawn. What remained was a smoking skeleton of charred timber and ash, a black scar on the land her father had kept pristine for 30 years. The banker arrived with the morning. Mr. Pemberton, thin and sharp in a suit that had no business being on a working ranch. He surveyed the destruction with the expression of a man calculating losses that weren't his. "The bank is calling in all outstanding loans," Pemberton announced. 30 days. Pay in full or the ranch goes to auction. Marla stood before him in her smoke-stained nightgown, her feet still bare ash in her hair, and burns on her hands from pulling a man out of a collapsing barn 4 hours earlier. "You're doing this now," she said. "Today, while the barn's still smoking. Recent events demonstrate financial instability. A shooting, an arrest, arson. These aren't markers of a sound investment. The only instability came from a foreman your bank approved and never questioned." Marla's voice could have frozen the creek in August. "How many fraudulent invoices did Harlan Briggs submit through your office, Mr. Pemberton? How many did your people approve without checking?" Pemberton's jaw tightened. 30 days, Miss Colton. That's the bank's final position." He turned to leave, then paused at the ranch gate without looking back. His shoulders drew together as if something had caught in his throat that he couldn't quite swallow. For a moment, he stood there, a thin man in a clean suit, at the edge of a property, scarred by the corruption his institution had enabled. Then he climbed into his wagon and drove away. And then the deputy arrived from Red Hollow with the news that finished what the fire had started. "Sheriff Dawson died this morning. Infection from the gunshot wound. Harlan Briggs is charged with murder." Marla received the words standing in front of the ruined barn. She didn't cry, didn't collapse. Didn't do any of the things grief demands of a person hearing that a man she'd known her whole life had died from a wound inflicted on her property. She turned to face the gathered cowboys. 36 men smoke-stained and exhausted and uncertain looking at her because there was no one else left to look at. My father built this ranch from nothing, she said. Her voice carried across the yard, across the ash and the ruin and the terrible weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. He drove every fence post, raised every wall, built this barn with lumber he hauled 60 miles on a wagon with 2 mules and a prayer. She paused. The silence was absolute. And if Henry Colton could build Broken Ridge from bare ground with nothing but his hands and his word, then we can rebuild it from this. Because what Harlan Briggs destroyed was wood and nails. What my father built was something that doesn't burn. It doesn't burn because it lives in every meal I've cooked in that kitchen. Every head of cattle we branded, every morning, every one of you showed up to work, land that someone told you wasn't worth working. Old Ferris removed his hat. One by one, the other hands did the same. So here's what's going to happen, Marla continued. We have 30 days before the bank takes everything. We have a murder trial coming. We have no barn, a dead sheriff, and a foreman in jail. And I am not leaving. I am not giving up. And I am not letting a single one of you go hungry while we figure out how to save what my father built. She looked at Silas. He stood at the edge of the group, ash-covered and silent, waiting. Mr. Calloway and I are going to fight this, in court, in Austin, wherever we have to. But right now, today, this morning, I need to know who's staying. Old Ferris stepped forward first, his weathered hand extended toward Marla. I worked for your father before you were born, he said. I'll work for his daughter until I can't sit a horse. One by one they came forward, 36 handshakes, 36 commitments made in the shadow of a burned barn on a morning that smelled like destruction and tasted like the beginning of something nobody could name yet. And in the kitchen, where the stove was still warm and the flour barrel was almost empty and there was work to be done that wouldn't wait for grief or justice or the luxury of falling apart. Marla Colton tied on a clean apron, opened her recipe book to the front pages where the actual recipes lived, and began making breakfast, because that's what her father had taught her. You feed people first. Everything else follows. They rode into Red Hollow on a Tuesday morning, Marla on her father's chestnut mare, and Silas on the bay that had carried him to Broken Ridge 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. It felt like a lifetime measured in gunshots and fire and stolen invoices and the slow, painful education of learning who to trust. The main street fell quiet when they appeared. Red Hollow was a town of 400 souls who survived on cattle money and gossip, and both had been in short supply since Harlan Briggs shot Sheriff Dawson on a ranch porch in broad daylight. Every eye tracked Marla and Silas from the moment their horses passed the livery stable to the moment they dismounted in front of Ridley's general store. Marla had chosen this spot deliberately. Ridley's was where the town gathered, where ranchers bought supplies and traded news and made the small agreements that held a community together. Her father had done business here for 30 years, had extended credit to families who couldn't pay, had loaned horses to neighbors whose stock went lame. Henry Colton's name still meant something on the street, and Marla intended to spend every cent of that currency. She stood on the store's wooden porch and spoke to whoever would listen. The wood beneath her feet was worn smooth by 30 years of boots and wagon wheels in the traffic of a community that Henry Colton had helped build with more than just his ranch. He'd served on the county board. He'd donated lumber for the schoolhouse. He'd ridden through a blizzard in '74 to deliver supplies to 3 families stranded by snow on the South Road. People remembered these things. Marla was counting on it. I'm Marlene Colton. My father was Henry Colton, who built Broken Ridge Ranch with honest labor and fair dealing. Some of you bought cattle from him. Some of you borrowed from him when times were lean. All of you knew what kind of man he was. People gathered. Slowly at first, then faster drawn by the gravity of a woman speaking with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. For 6 months, Harlan Briggs stole from my father's ranch. He inflated supply costs, sold cattle without recording the sales-skimmed wages from every man who worked for him. And when Sheriff Dawson came to see the truth for himself, Harlan shot him rather than open his books. He says you're lying. A man's voice from the crowd, hard to tell whose, says the stranger beside you is the real criminal. Marla didn't flinch. Then ask yourselves why a man from back east would spend 2 weeks mending fence and eating dust for cowhand wages if he was running a confidence scheme. Ask yourselves why he'd document every stolen dollar instead of joining the theft. Ask yourselves why Harlan Briggs needed to shoot a lawman if he had nothing to hide. The crowd shifted, murmurs building on murmurs. Silas spoke, kept it short, kept it honest, including the parts that made him look bad. My name is Silas Calloway. I investigate property fraud. I bought Broken Ridge to stop it from being stolen by a railroad syndicate that's been forcing small ranchers into foreclosure across Texas. I went undercover at the ranch, and I lied about who I was to everyone, including Miss Colton. That was wrong, but every accusation against Harlan Briggs is documented and provable, and I'll prove it in court. An older woman stepped forward from the gathered crowd. Gray-haired and straight-backed, with a face weathered by decades of Texas sun and Texas hardship, into something that resembled carved stone. I knew your father, Marlene. Henry helped my family when we had nothing, gave us credit when the bank turned us away. If you say Harlan stole from his ranch, I believe you. Others nodded. Not all of them, not even most, but enough. A tide turning slow and uncertain, but turning. Marla felt her throat tighten, but refused the tears. Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. That means everything. Brennan looked at Silas with the measuring gaze of a woman who'd spent 50 years separating honest men from liars. You planning to stay? Or just passing through once your investigation wraps up? The question every person in that crowd wanted answered. Silas looked at Marla, then at the town that had gathered around her because her father's name still carried weight even after death. I'm staying as long as Broken Ridge needs defending, he said, as long as there's work to be done. That's not much of a commitment, someone muttered. It's the truth, Marla said, and her voice carried over the muttering like a bell over wind, which is more than Harlan Briggs ever offered any of us. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The words that had been spoken in Red Hollow hung between them, heavy with implication. A public stand had been taken. There was no retreat from what came next. The trial's in 12 days, Silas said as they unsaddled. I know. Harlan's lawyer is named Whitmore. He's sharp. He's from Austin. And he's going to try to destroy your credibility on the stand. Marla hung her saddle on the rail with the precise care she gave everything. Let him try. I've got 6 years of feeding that ranch and 3 months of numbers that don't lie. Numbers aren't enough. Whitmore will make it personal. He'll go after your relationship with me, use it to suggest you're biased, manipulated, unreliable. Marla looked at him. Then I'll tell him what I told you. The numbers don't change depending on who I eat dinner with. The days before the trial passed in a blur of preparation and fear, and the relentless routine of feeding 36 men who needed breakfast regardless of what was happening in the world beyond the kitchen. Marla worked with the young prosecutor Harris, a nervous man barely past 30, who looked like he'd rather be trying property disputes than murder cases. She walked him through her evidence. The recipe journal, the stolen invoice, the cattle counts, the months of careful observation that nobody had asked her to do and nobody had helped her with until it was almost too late. They met in the ranch office that still smelled faintly of Harlan's tobacco and the particular sourness of secrets kept too long in enclosed spaces. Marla spread her documentation across the desk the way a general spreads maps before a battle. Harris took notes with the frantic energy of a man who'd expected a difficult case and instead found himself holding a weapon he hadn't known existed. These dates, Marla said, pointing to a column of numbers in her recipe journal. These are the actual delivery weights. I stood at the kitchen scale for every one of them, and thus she placed the stolen invoice beside the journal, or what Harlan billed the bank for. The difference on flour alone is over $400 in 6 months. Harris listened with the growing expression of a man realizing he'd been handed better ammunition than he'd dared hope for. This is remarkable, Miss Colton. You've essentially conducted your own forensic audit using a cookbook. My father taught me that numbers tell the truth even when people don't. I just wrote them down. You understand that Whitmore will try to dismiss this as a woman's household scribblings. Marla's eyes went cold. Then he'll be making the same mistake Harlan made, underestimating what a woman notices when nobody thinks she's paying attention. Harris studied her face for a long moment. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He recognized the quality of the witness sitting across from him. She wouldn't crumble on the stand. She wouldn't cry. She would deliver facts with the same steady precision she used to deliver biscuits, and the jury would have no choice but to listen. The trial started on a Tuesday that felt like the edge of a cliff. The Red Hollow Courthouse was a single-story building of limestone and determination built by men who believed that law and order could take root in hard country if you gave them a solid enough foundation. The limestone had come from a quarry 12 miles north, hauled by mule teams over roads that barely deserved the name. The building had survived floods and droughts and a fire of its own in '67, rebuilt each time because the people of Red Hollow understood that a town without a courthouse was a town without a future. Every seat was taken, ranchers in clean shirts they saved for Sundays and funerals. Townspeople who'd closed their shops early because the trial of Harlan Briggs mattered more than the day's commerce. Cowboys from Broken Ridge who'd ridden in before dawn, their horses tied in a long line behind the livery stable. The curious, the concerned, and the handful who'd come hoping to watch someone's life fall apart because watching other people's misery was the cheapest entertainment available in a town without a theater. Harlan Briggs sat at the defense table in a borrowed suit, his expression carefully composed into wounded innocence. Someone had trimmed his hair and shaved him clean, transforming the rough-edged foreman into something that resembled a respectable citizen wrongly accused. Beside him, Whitmore arranged papers with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd won cases harder than this one. His suit was tailored, his shoes were polished. Everything about him communicated the message that serious men handled serious matters, and the prosecution was neither. Marla sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap to keep them still. The recipe journal sat in her bag, 3 months of truth wrapped in a book of sourdough and stew. All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrington. The judge was a lean man with silver hair and the expression of someone who'd heard enough lies in his career to develop a permanent skepticism about the human capacity for honesty. He settled into his chair and surveyed the packed courtroom. "This is a murder trial," he said, "not a town social. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed and fined." "Mr. Whitmore, your opening statement." Harlan's lawyer stood, every movement calibrated to project authority and reason. "Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is not what it appears to be. What the prosecution calls murder, the evidence will show, was self-defense by a man cornered by a dangerous outsider. Silas Calloway infiltrated Broken Ridge Ranch under a false identity, seduced a grieving widow into supporting his scheme, and when Sheriff Dawson began investigating Mr. Calloway's fraud, violence erupted. My client Harlan Briggs, a decorated veteran and respected foreman, fired his weapon in a moment of justified fear for his own safety. Marla's nails cut crescents into her palms. Harris stood for the prosecution, younger, less polished, but carrying something Whitmore didn't: the weight of evidence he actually believed in. "The facts are straightforward," Harris began. "Harlan Briggs embezzled over $12,000 from Broken Ridge Ranch through falsified invoices, unreported cattle sales, and systematic wage theft. When Sheriff Dawson asked to examine the ranch ledgers, Mr. Briggs shot him rather than allow inspection. Sheriff Dawson died from that wound. That is not self-defense. That is the act of a guilty man silencing the one person who could expose him." Harris called Marla first. She took the stand the way she entered her kitchen every morning, with purpose, with the knowledge that what she was about to do mattered not because anyone would thank her for it, but because it needed doing. The bailiff swore her in. Her hand was steady on the Bible. "Miss Colton," Harris began, "please describe your role at Broken Ridge Ranch." "I've been the cook for 6 years. Before that, I grew up on the ranch. My father, Henry Colton, built it from nothing over 30 years. And after your father's death, what changed everything?" Harlan Briggs took over management. The bank in Austin approved him without consulting me. And from the first month, the numbers were wrong. "What do you mean by wrong?" Marla reached into her bag and produced the recipe journal. Harlan submitted supply invoices that didn't match what actually arrived at the ranch. "I weighed every delivery myself. I counted every sack of flour, every pound of coffee, every barrel of salt pork. The invoices claimed we received twice what was actually delivered. The difference was profit that went into Harlan's pocket. How can you be certain of these discrepancies? Because I've been feeding 36 men 3 meals a day for 6 years. I know exactly how much flour it takes to make biscuits for that many people. I know how much coffee they drink. I know how many eggs the hens lay and how many pounds of beef we go through in a week. These aren't guesses. They're numbers I've lived with every single day. She opened the journal, page after page of meticulous records, dates, quantities, comparisons between invoiced amounts in actual deliveries. 3 months of evidence gathered by a woman nobody thought was paying attention. Harris entered the journal as evidence. The jury leaned forward. Whitmore stood for cross-examination with the casual menace of a man sharpening a knife in public. Miss Colton, you kept these records in a recipe book, a cookbook essentially. Is that correct? It's where I had space to write. But you didn't keep formal accounting records. No ledgers, no double entry, bookkeeping, no formal inventory system. I kept records in the way available to me. Available to you, meaning informal, unverified, based on your personal observations rather than any standardized accounting methodology. Based on 6 years of doing the job, Marla replied. Her voice was level, almost conversational. I didn't need a methodology to know that 300 pounds of coffee is 6 times more than 36 men drink in a month. Whitmore shifted tactics. Miss Colton, what is your relationship with Silas Calloway? The courtroom held its breath. He's my partner in managing the ranch. Your partner. Whitmore let the word hang. Is it also true that you and Mr. Calloway have developed a personal relationship beyond ranch management? Marla could lie, could protect herself from the implication that love had clouded her judgment. But she'd made a promise to truth that preceded any promise she'd made to any man. We've become close, she said clearly. But the numbers in that journal don't change because of who I care about. 300 pounds of coffee is still a lie whether I'm alone or not. Whitmore smiled the smile of a lawyer who believed he'd drawn blood. Isn't it possible that Mr. Calloway, a self-admitted deceiver who infiltrated your ranch under false pretenses, manipulated your perceptions, fed you suspicions that aligned with his own agenda? Mr. Calloway didn't arrive at Broken Ridge until 9 days before Harlan was arrested. I'd been documenting discrepancies for 3 months before that. Would you like to check the dates in my journal? The smile on Whitmore's face flickered. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected the quiet cook with the recipe book to have a timeline that destroyed his narrative before it left the ground. Marla continued speaking, not to Whitmore, but to the 12 men and women on the jury. I started keeping those records because my father taught me that numbers don't lie. I didn't need a stranger from back east to tell me Harlan was stealing. I could see it in every delivery that came up short, every invoice that didn't match, every dollar that disappeared between what the ranch earned and what the ranch kept. The only thing Mr. Calloway did was confirm what I already knew. Whitmore retreated, no further questions. But the damage to his case was visible in the way 3 jurors were now looking at Marla with something closer to respect than skepticism. Silas took the stand next. Harris walked him through the investigation, the Austin bank records, the documentation of cattle sales to Grover Nettles that never appeared in ranch ledgers. The pattern of inflated invoices, matching a scheme he'd seen replicated across 6 other Texas ranches, all connected to a railroad syndicate acquiring land through manufactured foreclosure. Whitmore cross-examined with surgical precision. Mr. Calloway, you bought Broken Ridge Ranch 6 weeks before arriving. During those 6 weeks, did you inform Miss Colton of your purchase? No. Did you inform any employee of the ranch? No. So you lied. To everyone. For nearly 2 weeks. Including the woman you now claim to care about. I maintained an undercover identity to document criminal activity. The deception was wrong, and I've acknowledged that. Whitmore produced a document with the practiced flourish of a magician revealing his final trick. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Defense Exhibit A. A telegram from the Austin Bank and Trust dated 6 days ago. Harris objected. The document had been provided that morning barely within legal requirements. Judge Harrington allowed it with visible reluctance. Whitmore turned to the jury. This telegram states that the sale of Broken Ridge Ranch to Silas Calloway was never properly finalized. Required signatures were missing. The transaction is legally incomplete, which means Mr. Calloway does not own Broken Ridge Ranch, has never owned it. Every action he took, firing Mr. Briggs, accessing ranch records, making accusations of embezzlement, was done without legal authority. The courtroom erupted, voices overlapping, chairs scraping. Judge Harrington's gavel cracking against wood like a rifle shot. Order. Order in this court. Harris looked like a man watching his house burn down. If Silas didn't own the ranch, the foundation of the prosecution's case shifted from solid ground to quicksand. Every piece of evidence Silas had gathered became legally questionable. The embezzlement charges wobbled. Marla watched from the front row. She watched Harris fumble, watched Whitmore smile the satisfied smile of a man who just detonated a bomb beneath the prosecution's feet. Watched Harlan Briggs sit a little straighter at the defense table, hope returning to his face like color, returning to a dead man's cheeks. And something crystallized in her mind, sharp and cold and clear as creek water in January. She'd known about the inheritance law for months, had read about it in the county records office while pretending to search for her father's death certificate. But knowing your rights and having the resources to enforce them were two different things in 1879 Texas. No money for a lawyer, no ally in a position of power, no one willing to take a widow's legal claims seriously when the bank had already stamped its seal on a sale. She'd filed the knowledge away the way she filed everything carefully, quietly, waiting for the moment when it could be used. That moment was now. She stood. "Your Honor," Judge Harrington frowned. "Miss Colton, you have already given testimony. You cannot simply, I have new evidence relevant to the question of ranch ownership. Evidence that supersedes any bank transaction." Whitmore objected. Harris, caught off guard, said nothing. Judge Harrington studied Marla for a long moment, reading her face the way she read faces every morning across a kitchen table. "Approach the bench, Miss Colton," she'd approached. Steady, unhurried, carrying the weight of what she was about to say with the same quiet strength she carried everything. "My father, Henry Colton, died without a will," she said. Her voice was clear enough to reach the back row. "Under Texas inheritance law, when a property owner dies, intestate his estate passes to his next of kin. I am Henry Colton's only surviving child, his only heir." The courtroom went absolutely still. "The Austin Bank sold Broken Ridge Ranch to Mr. Calloway while my father's estate was still in probate. They sold property they did not have legal authority to sell, which means their transaction, complete or incomplete, is irrelevant because the ranch never left the Colton estate. It still belongs to me. It has always belonged to me." She placed documents on the judge's bench. Henry Colton's death certificate, probate records showing no will filed, her own birth record establishing her as sole heir, papers she'd kept in a cedar-lined cellar beneath her kitchen floor alongside stolen invoices, and a recipe journal full of damning numbers. "As the legal owner of Broken Ridge Ranch," Marla continued, "I have full standing to testify about financial irregularities on my property. I have full authority to present evidence of embezzlement against my foreman. And I have 3 months of documentation gathered independently before Mr. Calloway ever set foot on my land, proving that Harlan Briggs systematically stole from my father's ranch while I cooked his meals and signed his papers and waited for someone to believe me." She turned to the jury. "No one told me to keep those records. No one helped me count deliveries at 4 in the morning or compare invoices by lamplight after feeding 36 men. I did it because my father taught me that the truth lives in the numbers, and the numbers were lying, and I was the only person close enough to see it." Whitmore was on his feet. "Objection. This is improper. These ownership claims haven't been verified. The defense needs time to Judge Harrington examine the documents. They appeared to be in order." He looked at Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, you introduced a bank telegram to challenge ownership. Miss Colton has introduced probate records to establish hers. I'm going to allow this testimony and these documents. If you wish to challenge them, you may do so on cross-examination." Whitmore opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Before he could form words, the courtroom doors swung open. Mr. Pemberton walked in, the banker from Austin, the thin man in the two-new suit who'd stood on the porch of a burned ranch and demanded 30 days payment and who'd paused at the gate afterward, unable to leave cleanly, carrying something in his expression that looked like the early symptoms of a conscience reasserting itself. He looked as though he hadn't slept since that morning, and he looked as though whatever had kept him awake was now pushing him forward against every instinct of self-preservation he possessed. "Your Honor," Pemberton said, "I need to testify." Judge Harrington's patience was visibly thinning. "On what mattered on the telegram, Mr. Whitmore presented, and on the bank's involvement in the fraud perpetrated against Broken Ridge Ranch." Whitmore went pale. Harlan half rose from his chair before a deputy's hand pressed him back down. Pemberton was sworn in. His hands shook on the Bible, but his voice held. The telegram stating that Mr. Calloway's purchase was incomplete is a fabrication. I sent it at Mr. Whitmore's request to undermine the prosecution's case. The sale was legal and properly executed. Mr. Calloway owns Broken Ridge Ranch. Harris leaned forward. Why are you telling us this now? Because I helped build the scheme that destroyed this woman's life. Pemberton didn't look at Whitmore or Harlan. He looked at Marla. Harlan Briggs submitted inflated invoices to our bank for 6 months. I approved them. I knew they were fraudulent. We split the surplus 60% to Harlan, 40 to me. When the manufactured debt reached a threshold, the bank would foreclose and the property would be sold to the Pacific Western Railroad Syndicate for 10 times what the debt was worth. The courtroom erupted. Harrington's gavel fell like a thunderclap. I told myself it didn't matter. Pemberton's voice cracked but held. Told myself one widow losing a ranch she didn't legally own anymore was a small price for the profit involved. But then I sat in this courtroom and listened to Miss Colton testify about counting flour at 4 in the morning, about carrying numbers in her head because no one gave her a ledger, about a father who taught her that the truth lives in the math. He paused. The courtroom was silent enough to hear the wind moving through the street outside. And I realized that what I helped destroy wasn't a property investment. It was a man's life work, a daughter's inheritance. 30 years of honest labor reduced to numbers on a fraudulent invoice that I stamped and approved because the profit was good and the victim was invisible. Pemberton turned to the judge. I'm prepared to provide full documentation of the scheme. Bank records, correspondence with the railroad syndicate, wire transfers showing payments to Harlan Briggs. Everything. The courtroom sat in stunned silence for a long moment after Pemberton finished. Then Judge Harrington called a recess, and the room erupted into the barely controlled chaos of people who'd come expecting a murder trial and discovered they were witnessing the unraveling of a conspiracy that reached from a ranch kitchen in Red Hollow to the boardrooms of the Pacific Western Railroad in Houston. During the recess, Harris called 3 more witnesses. Cowboys from Broken Ridge who testified about stolen wages. Lee Pruitt, whose crooked nose told its own story before he said a word, described helping Marla track deliveries and watching Harlan sell cattle to Grover Nettles without recording the sales. Old Ferris, who'd worked for Henry Colton for 27 years, testified that the ranch had been profitable and well managed until Harlan took over, that the debt was manufactured, the decline was engineered, and the only person who'd been trying to stop it was the woman everyone told to stay in her kitchen and keep quiet. Whitmore cross-examined each one, but his questions had lost their edge. A lawyer's confidence comes from believing in the narrative he's selling, and Pemberton's testimony had burned that narrative to the ground. Every question Whitmore asked now sounded defensive rather than aggressive, a man swatting at smoke instead of fighting fire. The trial lasted another 2 hours, but it was over the moment Pemberton sat down. Whitmore's closing argument was a formality delivered to a jury that had already made up its mind. Harris barely needed a closing at all. He simply reminded the jury of what Marla Colton had said on the stand, that she'd been counting flour at 4 in the morning while the men who were supposed to protect her father's legacy were robbing it blind, that the truth had been there all along, written in a recipe book, invisible to everyone who decided a woman's observations weren't worth taking seriously. The jury deliberated for 38 minutes. The courtroom waited. Some people paced. Some sat still with the enforced patience of those accustomed to waiting for things beyond their control, whether cattle prices, the decisions of distant men in distant offices. Marla sat motionless in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the closed jury room door. Silas stood against the back wall, arms crossed, running the evidence through his mind one final time the way a man checks his ammunition before the last stand. Lee sat beside old Ferris on a bench near the window. The kid's knee bounced with nervous energy until the old cowboy placed a weathered hand on it, stilling the motion without a word. Some things between men needed no language. Steadiness was one of them. When the jury door opened, every person in the courtroom stopped breathing at the same instant. Guilty, murder in the first degree. The word moved through the courtroom like wind through dry grass. Harlan Briggs received it without expression, the way a man receives a diagnosis he's known was coming, but hoped to outrun. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, whether in comfort or restraint, it was hard to tell. The deputies moved forward. The handcuffs clicked shut with the small final sound of a door closing on one chapter of a very long story. 20 years in state prison. The gavel fell and it was finished. Pemberton was taken into custody for fraud. Whitmore packed his briefcase and left through the side door without speaking to anyone. Outside the courthouse, afternoon sun fell on Red Hollow's main street with the particular golden quality that comes to Texas in late summer when the light turns everything it touches into something that looks like a painting of a better world. Marla stood on the courthouse steps, and for the first time in 6 months, the weight she carried felt different. Not lighter exactly, but distributed, shared. Carried by the 36 men who were waiting back at the ranch by the townspeople who'd shown up to hear the truth by a 17-year-old kid who'd ridden to Red Hollow with a bloody nose and a telegraph message that brought federal attention to a county that had been looking the other way for too long. Old Ferris reached her first. His weathered hand engulfed hers, and his voice, rough as unfinished lumber, carried the only words that mattered. Your father would be proud. Not because we won, because you fought the way he would have fought, with the truth and nothing else. Lee was next, his nose still crooked from Harlan's fist, grinning wide enough to split his face. We did it, Miss Colton. You did it, Lee. That ride to Red Hollow saved everything. One by one, the Broken Ridge hands came forward. Handshakes and hat tips and the quiet acknowledgments of men who'd watched a woman fight for something they had all benefited from, and none of them had possessed the courage to fight for themselves. Mrs. Brennan pressed a jar of peach preserves into Marla's hands. For the kitchen, she said. Henry always liked my preserves. Marla held the jar against her chest and finally allowed herself to feel what she'd been holding back since the verdict. Not triumph, something quieter, something that felt like the first full breath after months of drowning. Silas waited until the crowd thinned. He stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, hat in his hands, looking up at her with those gray eyes that held something she hadn't seen in them before. Uncertainty. Not about the case, about what came after. He climbed the steps and pulled the deed from his coat. The original document, properly signed, and recorded his name in ink where Henry Colton's used to be. This belongs to you, he said. It always did. I was just holding it until you were ready to take it back. Marla looked at the paper. Legal proof of ownership, the thing she'd been fighting for since the morning after her father's funeral, when she'd realized that the world had decided her grief was an opportunity to steal everything he'd built. She could take it, sign her name where Silas's was, become sole owner of Broken Ridge Ranch, and owe nothing to no one. Instead, she pulled a pen from her bag, the same pen she'd used to sign Harlan's fraudulent invoices. For 6 months, the instrument of her humiliation turned to a different purpose. She signed her name beside his. Not above, not below, beside. Equal shares, she said. Equal say. I run the ranch because I know how. You handle the legal complications because that's what you do. Partners. Silas looked at the two names on the deed, his and hers side by side in ink that was still wet enough to smear if either of them lost their nerve. You sure about this? I'm sure that I don't want to fight alone anymore. And I'm sure that a man who mends fence and washes his own dishes and pulls horses out of burning barns isn't someone I need to be afraid of owing something to. She paused, looked at him directly. My father used to say the best partnerships are built on honest need. You need someone who knows this land. I need someone who knows how to fight battles that don't happen in kitchens and corrals. That's honest need. It is, but it's more than that, she said. Isn't it? Not a question. A reading, the same way she read everything, carefully, accurately, with the patience of a woman who trusted her own judgment because it had never failed her when she bothered to listen to it. Yes, Silas said. It's more than that. Then we figure out the more as we go. Starting with dinner, because 36 men have been waiting since morning and there is not a single biscuit on that table. They rode back to Broken Ridge as the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. The road between Red Hollow and the ranch ran through 7 miles of open prairie bordered by wire fences that Henry Colton had strung himself in scrub oak that grew in defiant clusters wherever the ground held enough moisture to sustain roots. Marla knew every mile of this road, had traveled it on horseback and in wagons, and once, when she was 8, and the wagon broke an axle on foot beside her father, who carried her the last 2 miles on his back because her shoes had worn through, and the ground was hard with late autumn frost. The burned skeleton of the barn stood against that sky like a monument to everything they'd survived. Not pretty, not inspiring, just true. A reminder that destruction was real and survival was possible, and the distance between the two was measured in the willingness of ordinary people to refuse surrender. The ranch hands were waiting in the yard, not anxious now, not uncertain, waiting the way men wait when they know the person they're waiting for is someone worth waiting for. Old Ferris had organized them without being asked. The temporary corral was repaired. The workhorses were watered and fed. Someone had swept the kitchen porch and left a bucket of fresh water by the door, the small courtesies of men who'd finally understood what Marla Colton had been doing for them every day for 6 years and wanted in their rough and wordless way to return the favor. Marla dismounted and walked straight to the kitchen. Her kitchen. Not because a deed said so, but because she'd earned it with 6 years of 4 o'clock mornings and 36 plates served 3 times a day, and the stubborn, unshakable conviction that feeding people was not a small thing, that keeping a ranch alive through its kitchen was not lesser work, that a woman with flour on her hands and numbers in her head could fight corruption and win. Silas followed her, not leading, not directing, present, the way a partner is present, available but not intrusive, capable but not controlling. A man who'd learned over the course of 2 extraordinary weeks that the strongest person on Broken Ridge Ranch had been there all along, invisible in plain sight, keeping the whole operation alive from the one room nobody thought to look at. Dinner that night was simple. Roast beef from their own cattle biscuits, from the last of the flour coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Marla served it the way she always served it. Every plate placed with care. Every man acknowledged. But something was different. The men looked at her differently now, not with the absent gratitude of people who expect to be fed without thinking about who feeds them. With recognition. With the understanding that the woman carrying plates to their table was the same woman who'd stood in a courtroom and dismantled a conspiracy with a recipe book, in the memory of her father's voice teaching her that numbers don't lie. Lee ate 3 helpings of biscuits and didn't try to hide it. Old Ferris said thank you when she refilled his coffee the first time in 6 years he'd said those words aloud at this table. Small things. But Marla noticed them the way she noticed everything, and each one settled into the place inside her chest, where grief had been living for 6 months, slowly replacing the ache with something warmer. Something that felt like the beginning of being seen. When the last plate was cleared, Lee lingered at the kitchen door. "Miss Colton," he said, then hesitated, searching for words that 17 years of living hadn't fully equipped him to find. "My pa always said Mr. Colton was the best man he ever worked for. I think maybe he raised the best woman, too." He was gone before Marla could respond, which was probably for the best because she wouldn't have trusted her voice. After the dishes were washed and the kitchen cleaned, and the hands had drifted to the bunkhouse, Marla and Silas stood on the kitchen porch. The same porch where she'd told him about her father. The same porch where he'd sat alone, making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The stars were out. The same stars that had watched Henry Colton drive his first fence post into this ground 30 years ago. The same stars that had watched Marla grow up in a kitchen that smelled like bread and coffee, and the warmth that comes from a place where someone cares enough to feed you well. "You could leave," Marla said. "Your case is closed. Harlan's convicted. The railroad scheme is exposed. Your firm in the East has what they need." "They do. So why stay?" Silas was quiet for a while. The night insects sang. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse shifted in the temporary corral they'd built to replace the burned barn. "Because I've spent 8 years moving from one investigation to the next. 17 cases, 17 towns. 17 times I've ridden in, exposed the corruption, and ridden out before the dust settled. And every time I told myself that justice was enough, that the work mattered more than the place or the people." He looked at her. "But this is the first place where I wanted to stay for breakfast." Marla laughed, quiet and real and surprised out of her by the simple honesty of it. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. And it involves breakfast. I told you I wasn't good at this. You're better than you think." Marla leaned against the porch rail, her shoulder almost touching his. "My father said you judge a man not by what he promises, but by what he does when nobody's watching. You washed your own plate the first morning. Offered to help clean up when no cowhand in history has ever volunteered for kitchen duty. Mended fence without complaining. Pulled horses out of a fire." She turned to face him. "And when I told you I didn't need your apology, that I needed your help, you didn't argue. didn't explain, just said yes. That's what I'm building on, Silas. Not words, not promises. What you did when it mattered. The space between them was small now. Small enough that either of them could close it. Neither did. Not yet. Because some distances are worth crossing slowly with the full weight of understanding what waits on the other side. We've got a barn to rebuild, Marla said, and back wages to pay, and a bank to hold accountable for enabling 6 months of theft, and 36 men who need to know their jobs are secure. And breakfast, Silas said. 36 men who need breakfast. And breakfast. Marla smiled. Always breakfast. She went inside. Not because the moment was over, but because some moments are better left unfinished. Left open like a door you know you'll walk through when the time is right. Silas stayed on the porch a while longer. The stars turned overhead, indifferent and eternal, the way they'd turned over this land since before fences and ranches and the complicated struggles of people who love things they couldn't control. Inside the kitchen, lamplight glowed in the window. The sound of Marla preparing tomorrow's dough carried through the thin walls. A quiet, rhythmic sound. The sound of a woman building something. Not with lumber and nails and the brute force of frontier ambition, but with flour and patience, and the absolute refusal to stop working when the world gave her every reason to quit. Marlene Colton had walked into that courthouse carrying a recipe book and walked out carrying the deed to her father's ranch. Not because a man had saved her, not because the law had remembered her, because she had saved herself one stolen invoice at a time, one careful number at a time, one 4 o'clock morning at a time, building her case in the back pages of a cookbook while the world looked right through her. And now the world had no choice but to see. Broken Ridge Ranch stood in the Texas darkness, scarred and incomplete, one building, short and $1,000 in debt, and facing a future that nobody could guarantee. But the kitchen light was on. The stove was warm, and tomorrow morning, before the sun had the decency to rise, Marla Colton would be standing at that counter, flour on her hands, feeding 36 men who finally understood what it cost her to keep them whole. And somewhere in Austin, a federal marshal would be reading a telegraph from a 17-year-old kid with a crooked nose, in the investigation that would dismantle the Pacific Western Railroad Syndicate's land acquisition scheme across 6 Texas counties would begin in earnest. Marla didn't know that yet, wouldn't know for weeks. But the seeds she'd planted in a recipe book. Numbers recorded by lamplight deliveries wait at dawn, cattle counted from a kitchen window. Those seeds would grow into the strongest case the territorial courts had seen in a decade. That was the legacy Henry Colton had left his daughter. Not land, though the land was hers now. Not cattle or buildings or the deed to 40,000 acres of hard Texas ground. He'd left her something the bank couldn't sell, and Harlan couldn't steal, and fire couldn't burn. The knowledge that feeding people was not a small thing. That keeping others alive through your labor and your care and your stubborn daily refusal to surrender was the most important work there was. And that the woman in the kitchen was never just the cook. She was the one who held it all together. She always had been.